throughout these sessions, I'm going to be including a lot of additional information from my research. There's one very important one that I want you to have very, very early on, and that is the notion of conflicting intent. When people first become aware of things like power of thought, very often they try to use it to influence the stock market or to win the lottery, things like that. In fact, my own father, when he was first learning about my early research and reading some of my early writings, he went out and tried to immediately influence the stock market to see if it worked, right? This idea of conflicting intent is a very, very important one, and it's illustrated very well through ideas like the lottery and the stock market. Think about trying to influence a company, especially a major company. You're talking about a huge number of stakeholders, employees, vendors, investors, families that are involved, consumers maybe of that company. I mean, just a huge amount of people have a vested interest in that company. That's a lot of people's intent that's going into moving the stock price or the success or the earnings or all the things that go into the stock price of that particular company around at any given time. It's an enormous pool of intent, a lot of conflicting intent. Can you really expect to have that much of an impact on that? I think you have to be realistic and say to yourself, no, you really can't. And let me even back this up a little bit and say with things like the stock market, there are winners and losers. Well, what's the actual goal? If someone goes out and they try to win the lottery or they try to influence a stock, the goal is to make more money, right? Well, if your actual goal is to make more money, aren't there more positive ways to do it? Does someone have to be a loser so that you can be a winner? Does someone have to pay the price for your goals? It's very important as you think about using these techniques that you think about how you can minimize the harm from them. Remember we talked about the Ha right, and we talked about my friend finally feeling like he could use that to manifest sort of a dream car for him. Well, one very important piece of the Ha right is that you have to spend a lot of time contemplating how what you're requesting, what you're manifesting, is not going to produce harm for others. That's a great caveat. It applies absolutely across these sort of ideas of synchronicity, of increasing synchronicity, of power of thought, of the law of attraction, of new thought, whatever you want to call it. I like to mitigate this and recommend that people mitigate this by putting a highest good sort of intent out there. This is a very common sort of new agey, very sort of spiritually type thing. The notion that you pray for the highest good to be done, or that you request something, but it be within the bounds of the highest good for everyone. There's lots of different ways to do this. There's lots of different ways to frame this. I think even just feeling that you'd like it to come about in a way that's positive or as positive as possible for everyone involved, that can be enough. Let me give you a couple of additional examples here. So many years ago, I was in Los Angeles with a friend of mine, and he practiced ritual magic. So he specifically practiced forms of magic that related to things like the Golden Dawn and the OTO. If you're familiar with those, great. If not, you can look them up on Google. But that's basically ritual magic, Western ritual magic. And he did a certain ritual to bring in a certain amount of money. Well, very shortly after he did that, he wound up slicing his hand open at work. And he got, a settlement from Workman's Comp for this very severe injury. That's an example of not putting a caveat on things to minimize harm or to occur in a positive way or for the highest good or for however it is that you want to think about putting that intent into your use of these principles. Let me give you another story. More recently, a friend of mine who I taught these, and business partner who I taught these techniques to, used them, and he wound up in a situation where shortly after he used them, a number of people from sort of a competing division within the company, his company, got fired. Now, in that company, it was very, very difficult to get fired. In fact, people largely thought it was impossible to get fired. I mean, people just got away with so much. And yet he came in one day and basically All of these people that had been opposing what he wanted to do were literally gone. They were fired. They were terminated. That's another example. It took him months before he went back to using these methods again, simply because he felt so guilty over that. It certainly seems as though it's possible to produce an impact on the world, to increase synchronicity, to have things happen, utilizing the right combination of techniques for ourselves as individuals. What I'm trying to impress upon you here is two things. First, there's a competition for resources. There's a lot of conflicting intent out there. If you want to go after the lottery or the stock market, and let me give you a third one, money, that we'll talk about in just a minute. A lot of competing intent for those three things. Good luck. You're just a drop in the ocean. And the second is that you have an obligation to really minimize harm, to try to have things come about in the most positive way possible. And so you need to make sure that you're building that into your intent, that you're building that in with your visualizations, that you're building that in with your emotionality, and that you're building it in with the other techniques that we'll be talking about in later sessions. Now let me come back to this idea of money, because it's by far the number one thing that everybody tries to manifest using these techniques, right? You hear about these techniques, you're going to try to do something with money. The lottery and the stock market, they relate to that, but a lot of people just think, okay, I'm going to just visualize more money coming in, money being in a bank account, or I'm going to, the secrets popularized a very old technique of, writing out a check to yourself with a certain day, and on that day being able to cash it, or whatever. I don't care what your method is. The reality is that money is a concept. Money is a symbol. It's out there. And there's a lot of conflicting intent. I don't think there can be much other than maybe health or something like that. There can be much more conflicting intent around something than there is money. So how is it that you think that with a bunch of people out there, billions of people basically wanting to be millionaires, that if you visualize yourself becoming a millionaire, that's going to happen for you? That somehow you've just got this enormous amount of intent and capability that no one else out there has. Or that maybe the universe just has an infinite amount of millionaires to create. And those are all wonderful ideas, but the reality is that on Earth there are finite resources. There are limits to the amount of the money supply, for example, regulated by central banks generally. And so there's only going to be so many millionaires. A better way to think about this, viewing it through this idea of conflicting intent, is to ask yourself, what would you do with the money? Because I can guarantee you that there's a lot fewer people out there visualizing a midnight blue Mercedes with a tan interior that's made out of leather and a certain type of chrome wheel, etc., etc. You get the idea. The more details you add into your visualization, the more details you add into your goals, the more you're getting away from this idea of conflicting intent. One of the things that people often practice with are parking spots. Seeing an empty parking spot. And if you're familiar with my book, The Fourth Awakening, one of the very first things that I shared with my co-author to start playing around with when we started writing that book was start visualizing parking spots that are empty. Well, he had the store that he lived in South Carolina, and he had the store that he goes to all the time, a grocery store. And in South Carolina, during the summer, it's hot. And you want a spot with shade to park your car under, so your car isn't 1,000 degrees when you get out from the grocery store. So he started visualizing one of the tiny, 2 or 3 spots at this grocery store being available for him before he went to the grocery store. And as I speak right now, he's on a streak of 100 visits or something to the grocery store where he's gotten it every time. Not a lot of conflicting intent when he's going to the grocery store for that spot. And that's a great example of that notion. So as you're constructing your goals, as you're constructing what you want, try to incorporate this idea of conflicting intent. The more specific you make something, generally speaking, the less conflicting intent there's going to be associated with it. Now, it also works with generalities. So also, the more general you make things, Now, normally with generalities, it's going to be emotions, right? You might say to yourself, I want to have a lot more of a certain kind of love in my life. If you don't actually visualize how you want that to occur, you leave a vast potential for how that can manifest. And what do you care what the conflicting intent is around that at that point? I mean, love is one of those things that's could very well be an infinite amount of that in the universe. You're not fighting over the money supply, for crying out loud. So these are just some different ideas, some different ways to sort of think about this very core concept of conflicting intent. It's a very, very important piece of this that almost no one ever thinks about or considers.